Hello, friends, and welcome to my bookshelf tour. I'm going to start because it's going to be a long video. So, the first book on my shelf is Middlemarch by George Eliot in the Penguin English Library edition. This shelf has all the books which I have already read. The second book is The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. I was not a huge fan of this book. The next one is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This is the vintage Russian edition of this classic, and it was an amazing read. Next up is The Odd Women by George Gissing in the Oxford World's Classics edition. Another favorite book of mine. I loved reading this book. The next is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is a Penguin Deluxe edition. Honestly, I was not a huge fan of Jane Eyre. Next up is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott in the Penguin Indian Classics edition. I have 4 of these. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Surprisingly, this was a great book. Then I have Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, another Russian classic. Not a typical book, but interesting nevertheless. Then I have Persuasion by Jane Austen, my favorite Austen book for years, and I like it more than I like Pride and Prejudice. Then I have some of my Penguin Popular Classics edition. The first one is The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. The first Hardy which I read and I really enjoyed it. Then I have Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Next up is The Europeans by Henry James. This was the first book by Henry James which I read, and it was a very fun and interesting book. Then I have some vintage classics with the red spine. The first one is Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. This was a huge book, but I really enjoyed his writing style. Then I have Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. This was also such a sweet read. I really enjoyed it, even though it was 800 pages long. Then I have Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. And then I have A Country Doctor's Notebook by Michael Bulgakov. I really enjoyed this collection of short stories. I love how all the spines of the red books match. Next I have I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith and 1984 by George Orwell, a dystopian classic. And the last book on this shelf is a hardcover of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows by J.K. Rowling. I cried 4 or 5 times while reading this book for the first time. It was definitely a mind-blowing book. So this was the first shelf. Now moving on to the second one, I have a collection of Wordsworth classics, Collins classics, and some vintage and Penguin classics. So the first one here is this massive book, which is Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Then I have Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. I loved this book, and I can understand why this book is so famous. Then I have Adam Bede by George Eliot. George Eliot is one of my favorite authors, so I'm trying to collect all of her books. The next is The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. This was also a very long book, but very fun and easy to read. Then I have Desperate Remedies by Thomas Hardy. This book was not a huge favorite of mine. Next is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. No words can be enough to describe this book. It is an amazing story and an amazing book. I think I have read this book a million times. Then I have The Professor by Charlotte Bronte. Next I have Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which I need to reread. And the last Wordsworth classic on this shelf is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Now, moving on to the Collins classics, the first one is The American by Henry James. Next is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. It was a short story but a fun one. Then I have Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. I love this book. This is such a simple story but such a cute one. Then I have Dracula by Bram Stoker. Next is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Next is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I have seen the movie for this book as well. And then the last Collins classic is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is such a great book. I love the story. I love the writing. I love the BBC miniseries for this book. It's a great book. Moving on to the old vintage classics, I have Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Emma by Jane Austen. So both the books by Jane Austen from the vintage editions match and they look so lovely together. Here I have Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope, another massive book, but a very fun and interesting read. Trollope's books are just so easy to read. And the last book on this shelf is The Black Tulip by Alexander Dumas. So these two shelves have all the books which I have already read. Now moving down, the lower two shelves have all the classics which I have not read yet. So the first book here is a Penguin classic, and it is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's a chunker of a book, but I am really looking forward to reading this. Then I have some vintage red spines. The first one is The Cranford Chronicles by Elizabeth Gaskell. Then I have David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, another very long book. Then I have The Trial by Franz Kafka. The only book by Kafka which I have read is The Metamorphoses. Then I have my Kindle here, which is I think the second generation Kindle from Amazon. Next I have The Master and Margarita by Michael Bulgakov. These are such cute editions by Penguin. All the red ones are Russian and I think blue are Swedish or something. Every nationality has a different color code for the different classics. They're all translated works. Then I have The 40 Rules of Love by Elif Shafak. Then I have some of my Wordsworth classics which I have not read yet. The first one is The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Then I have Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Then I have Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Wait, I have already read this book. I accidentally put this on the wrong shelf, so I'm going to put them with my read books right here. Next is Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. I also have the movie for this, which I'm going to watch after I finish reading the book. I started reading this book. I think I read a couple of pages, but I need to be in the right mood for this book because it is a very emotional read. Next is Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, the only Austen novel which I haven't read yet. The Awakening and Selected Stories by Kate Chopin. Then I have The Importance of Being Earnest and Other Plays by Oscar Wilde. This is the vintage white spine edition. Then I have The Iliad by Homer, Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I still haven't read any book by Wilkie Collins. Next is Grimm's Fairy Tales by Jacob and William Grimm. Now moving on to the fourth shelf, these are all the classics which I have not read yet. So starting here, let me just move this decoration piece. It was a present from a very dear friend. She bought it from Saudi Arab. So the first book here is a Penguin English Library edition of Villette by Charlotte Bronte. Next is The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope. It is a book in the series. Then I have a vintage Russian edition of Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. These editions are so beautiful and I cannot wait to read it. Then I have 4 Oxford World Classics. The first one is East Lynne by Ellen Wood. Next is The Eustace Diamonds by Anthony Trollope. I think this is the 3rd or 4th book in the Palliser series. Then I have Orley Farm by Anthony Trollope. It is a standalone novel by Trollope. And last Oxford classic is Mary, the Wrongs of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, who is the mother of Mary Shelley. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This is a Signet classic and this is their 200th anniversary edition. Then I have Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, not sure about the pronunciation again. Then I have Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens, Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore, Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope, another book of the Palliser series, The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, and the last book on the shelf is The Ambassadors by Henry James. Now moving on to the next shelf, here I have the book which I am currently reading and it is The Trumpet Major by Thomas Hardy. Here are some other books which are on my TBR pile. The first one is Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare. Next is Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. These are the Collins classics. Then I have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is on the wrong shelf. I've already read this book. This is the hardcover of the Penguin English Library editions. Next is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Felix Holt the Radical by George Eliot. This is the Old Wordsworth Classic Edition. Reclaim Your Heart by Yasmin Mujahid. This was a present from my sister-in-law. Moving on to the other side of the fake plant, I have some random books and comics. The first one is Archie's Pals and Girls. I used to read them when I was younger. Then I have Way to the Quran by Khurram Murad. Then I have a map of northern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Gilgit-Baltistan. So I just have a random collection of things here. This is The Concept of God in Major Religions by Dr. Zakir Naik. The Conduct of the Prophet During Hajj by Faisal Al-Badani. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. How Islam Touched Their Hearts. Lessons for Every Sensible Person by Imtiaz Ahmed. Religious Obligations of Muslim Women by Dr. Israr Ahmed. And the last book here is Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in the Bible by Professor Abdul Ahad Dawood. Then I have some Penguin Popular Classics. The first one is Grimm's Fairy Tales by Brothers Grimm. This is my second edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales. Then I have King Lear by William Shakespeare. It is one of the two plays by Shakespeare which I have read, and honestly Shakespeare is so hard for me to read. Then I have Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. It was one of my least favorite Dickens book because I had to read this in college. Then I have The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is a collection of his short stories. I think I have read only one of the short stories in here. Next is Inferno by Dan Brown. So I was a huge fan of Dan Brown and I used to read all of his books, but I think they're getting a bit monotonous, so I haven't read Inferno yet. Next is Gone by Michael Grant, another book which I bought and never decided to read. Now moving on to the next shelf, it has a random collection of books which I have read or I haven't, but I'm not going to take these with me when I move. So the first ones are Divergent and Insurgent by Veronica Roth. I have read Divergent, but I haven't read Insurgent. I have watched all the movies based on the series. Next I have The Return of the Butterfly by Moni Mohsin and The Diary of a Social Butterfly by Moni Mohsin. This is also a book series by a Pakistani author, and it's basically a diary of this young woman. It's very funny, really hilarious, and worth a read. Next is Think Before It's Too Late by Edward de Bono. I bought this book as a present for my brother, but since he never read it, I took it back from him. Then I have Veronica Decides to Die by Paulo Coelho. I've never read this book and I've had this with me for ages now. And it's such a short book, I have no idea why I never pick it up. Then I have Fantasy Stories for Girls. There are 3 novels in here: Unicorns of Balinor, The Princess School, and The Rihanna Chronicles. I really enjoyed it as a kid. Next is Things We Did Not See Coming by Stephen Amsterdam. I think I bought this book 5 years ago, haven't got a chance to read it yet. A Case of Exploding Mangoes by Muhammad Hanif. This is by far the best historical fiction by a Pakistani author which I have read. This edition is falling apart. I think I'm going to get a new one. Next is Thinking of You by Jill Mansell. Deception Point by Dan Brown. Next I have this very old edition of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Now this is an illustrated book, and I remember as a kid I used to sit and color the illustrations. Rising Tides by Nora Roberts, one of my favorite books by Nora Roberts, and this book made me read 50 other books by Nora Roberts. They are such cute and happy stories, and this woman knows how to write a page turner. Next I have this extremely damaged paperback of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince by J.K. Rowling. I have used a lot of scotch tape to put this together, but as you can see, it has been read a lot, hence it has been damaged a lot. But I'm a huge Potterhead, so I damaged all my Harry Potter books. This one is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Then I have Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, which was the 4th book in the series. This is the American edition, and then some of them are the UK editions. This is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban by J.K. Rowling. And I think I have given the second book to my brother to read. This is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which was the first book of the series. So the second one is missing because I gave it to my younger brother for a read. Next is A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. This is from the author of The Kite Runner, and it was an amazing book. I really enjoyed reading it. Then I have That Summer in Paris. I basically rescued this book. It was found in one of my college buses and it was just lying there for days and nobody was picking it up, and I realized that it did not belong to anybody. And it's actually an autobiography by Morley Gallagher, who was friends with Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it's about their travels together. So I thought it sounded interesting and I kept it. Then I have The Princess Diaries to the Nines. This is the 9th book in the series. And I also have the 8th book in the Princess Diaries series, which is after 8. I have read all the books, all 10 books, but I just have 2 with me. And they look so cute together. Then I have a couple of other comic magazines, the Love Digest magazine and then the Archie Digest. The Secret of the Old Mill by Franklin W. Dixon. The Firm by John Grisham. This was a present from my brother-in-law. The Bride's Boon Tuhfatul Urus by Mahmoud al-Istanbuli. This was also a present from my cousin. Now moving down to the next shelf, these are all the books which I have read, but I will not be taking them with me. The first one is After the Prophet, the epic story of the Shia-Sunni split by Leslie Hazelton. Eldest by Christopher Paolini and Brissinger by Christopher Paolini. This is from the Inheritance Cycle. The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. The Jane Austen Book Club by Karen Joy Fowler. This was a great book because every month the book club read one book by Jane Austen, and I color coded these so I knew which book was being read. So once I finish reading a Jane Austen book, I usually like to come here and read their reviews and their ideas about that book. Next is Animal Farm by George Orwell, an epic short story. Then I have English Fairy Tales. This is the Wordsworth Classics edition. Moth Smoke by Mohsin Hamid. It was a great read, and there was a chapter about air conditioning in here which was pretty amazing. Next I have How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia by Mohsin Hamid. The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy in the Rupa Classics edition. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. Living Dead in Dallas by Charlene Harris. The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is the Puffin Classics edition. Don't Want to Miss a Thing by Jill Mansell. When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. The Wandering Falcon by Jamil Ahmed. Next I have some children's books. 5 Get Into Trouble, the famous 5-book series by Knight Blyton. 5 Run Away Together, and then 5 Go to Billycock Hill. 5 Go Adventuring Again. How to Stop Worrying and Start Living by Dale Carnegie. Next is Dead in the Water, the Hardy Boys case file series by Franklin W. Dixon. Then I have a book in the Nancy Drew files, The Strange Memories by Caroline Keene. Then I have The Valley of Adventure by Knight Blyton. Next is The Island of Adventure by Knight Blyton. Then I have The Riddle That Never Was by Knight Blyton. The Adventurous Four Trapped by Knight Blyton. And another famous 5-book, 5 Have Plenty of Fun by Knight Blyton. So this was my last shelf, and then on this side I have just a couple of books, and these are some files, some photo albums. I have this book over here. This is Shahab Nama by Qudratullah Shahab. It's a book in Urdu. It's an autobiography of this guy. It was a gift from my mother, another hardcover. I think I read it I think I read just like 100 pages. Then I left it and now I have forgotten the story. So I need to come back to this one. These are just some random journals. Then I have this book, 100 Great Wonders of the World. So that is it, guys. That was the complete tour of my bookshelf. This is what my bookshelf looks like from afar. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please don't forget to thumbs up this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Bye.